Hey, g'day and welcome to the first session of the last Tuesday of the month PME. My name is Major Jeremy Barraclough here at Headquarters 2nd Division. Hopefully this will be the first of many sessions we carry out throughout this year to provide education to those in 2nd Division and elsewhere, wherever you're dialing in from. I'd like to offer some credit to the Cove for helping facilitate this, otherwise we would not be able to communicate with you all today. And just to start, for a disclaimer, the views presented in this session today are my own. I've generated it from open source information and they do not represent the official policy of the Australian Army, Department of Defence or the Australian Government. My objective here today is to offer some reflections on critical thinking and its practical application for military professionals. Basically, I want to get you to think about how you are thinking and also suggest some tools to help us all be a little bit better at it. So what I'm going to go through today is a couple of vignettes and then some tools for some military professionals. It should take around about 20 or 30 minutes of me talking, and then I'll open it up to questions and we'll see how we go, but it won't go for longer than an hour. And I encourage any questions and commentary now or via the Cove later, and you'll see the phone number to send your text messages through on the screen. So without further ado, when we think about critical thinking, what is it? What do we mean? Well, often in the military, we get confused between critical thinking and criticism. So let's start with what it is not. Critical thinking is not criticism, it's not fault finding in a process, and it's not fault finding in evidence or a decision. That's not critical thinking. Critical thinking is purposeful, it is deliberate, it is considered, and it's reflective with a conscious and appropriate level of skepticism. So according to some experts, like Professor Diane Helpman, she provided a good broad definition of what critical thinking is. And she says, critical thinking is the use of those cognitive skills and strategies that increase the probability of a desired outcome. It's used to describe thinking that is purposeful, reasoned, and goal-directed. Now that's great, but what is a critical thinker? Well, a couple of other experts have also provided some good guidance. They say that a well-cultivated critical thinker raises some vital questions and vital problems. They gather and assess relevant information and they can effectively interpret it to come to well-reasoned conclusions and solutions and test them against relevant criteria and standards. They think open-mindedly with alternative systems of thought, importantly not just a single system of thought, and they recognise and assess as need be their assumptions, implications and the practical consequences. Now, before we go any further, I'm not an artificial intelligence specialist and I know and understand that there are gaps in my knowledge here, and I encourage those more informed than me to contribute to discussion afterwards. But what I'll point out is when we start talking about critical thinking and thinking in the Army, a lot of people start pointing towards artificial intelligence. And some point out that the advent of AI could indeed do all the necessary thinking in a sort of template format for us. Perhaps this is true, but I think AI still has a long way to go, and I'll offer my thoughts on why. And I started out asking AI to generate an image of an Australian Army officer engaged in critical thinking, and these were the results. They don't quite look right, and I think the images generated that you see there, they demonstrate the point exceedingly well. And the point is that AI can only generate or regenerate combinations of existing data. To a human who has experience to apply their own judgment from their experience, these responses, they don't quite fit. They don't quite look like an Australian Army officer as we would recognise them, and it just doesn't quite seem to make sense. And the point is that AI can't really generate brand new ideas. It can only really, and it can't even really verify or build a compelling argument. Rather, it just tends to weight volumes of data to compose a response based on a sort of statistical analysis. So a human, however, particularly one well attuned to think on the question, will certainly come to a different conclusion than that of the AI. So I took it a step further and I asked the AI to define critical thinking. After several attempts, I found this the most adequate. And it's still not great, but it kind of gets there. And it said to me that critical thinking is good because it allows individuals to make well-informed and reasoned decisions. In today's world, there's a constant stream of information coming at us from multiple sources, and not all of it is accurate or is it reliable. Critical thinking allows us to evaluate the information we receive, consider multiple perspectives and evidence, and make evidence-based decisions based on sound reasoning rather than instinct or bias. By applying critical thinking skills, we're better equipped to navigate complex issues. Okay, but so what? Well, from the AI, that's a pretty good response, but that's the point. This is not the AI answer. This is an answer that the AI found, shaped by several curated inputs, and was filtered and judged by a human to place it into a context of relevance. So it does raise some good points though, and I've underlined them. So critical thinking is well informed, and critical thinking evaluates information and perspectives. Critical thinking uses reasoning, logic, and judgment to arrive at decisions. And I'll just reiterate it that AI cannot do these things, nor can the individual who attempts to use AI generate templated responses as a substitute for thinking. That is the domain of a human being, and that's the domain of our military professionals. So we've kind of ironically provided a working definition of what critical thinking is, and also by showing what it is not. And I'm sure the adult learners in the room right now are asking, so what? And I also hear you military audiences murmur, where's the dead guy quote? Well, here it is, because helpfully, critical thinking was considered by our old Prussian friend. And he describes the context and content of war. It's complex, it's complicated, it's volatile, and it is violent. Chaos ensues when actors resist each other in violent and non-violent means whilst adapting to each other's tactics and strategy. This can arguably be extended to other states who are also not party to the conflict. It can also be extended to the general populations and even the physical environment itself. In such scenarios, which by the way is every scenario, templates have very little utility. Therefore, these adaptive problems exist in volatile, uncertain, complex, connected, congested, conflated, and ambiguous environments. They will require critical thinking, and hopefully the following example will show it's not just our own critical thinking that must be considered in these contexts, but also we need to consider those who also exist in these complex, connected, congested environments. So, during the Battle of Fallujah on the 7th of April 2004, US Marines came under heavy fire from a minaret from the Abdulaziz al-Samari Mosque. As their general advance slowed, they came under tactical pressure to clear the position of Sunni insurgents. Small arms fire from the Marines' squad weapons could not actually locate their mark on their target. So after some consideration, they escalated to a call for fire from a single Hellfire missile from their Cobra attack helicopter. That single missile failed to hit its target, and the ground force commander elected not to re-attack for fear of further collateral damage. So, pinned as they were, the Marines had to make a decision, and the ground force commander, as you can see on the screen there, they decided at point 2 to bring down that perimeter brick wall so that they could force entry and then have a ground force clearance assault through the facility or through the mosque. So in order for the Marines to enter and make that entry point, they had an F-15 drop 2 500-pound bombs to drop that wall. Once they dropped the wall, they could make entry, and moments later, on clearance, they found no militias inside the compound and no enemy casualties. The minaret shooters had extracted themselves once they realised that their position was untenable. Now, this seems pretty straightforward, but a sound set of tactical decisions and sound ethical decisions that were also documented carefully by the Marines. However, at the time, the Associated Press reporter, Abdul Qadir Saidi, relayed eyewitness accounts that 40 people had been killed during that action. Now, importantly here, we need to consider the bravery of that particular reporter existing in the battle space as a civilian, just trying to do their job as providing information as an observer. We also need to consider the nature of the wire services, as in they're just trying to push out short snippets of information as they understand them at the time. And importantly, I just want to make sure that everybody's clear that I'm not questioning the integrity of that initial reporter. However, his story once started, however, it quickly morphed into something else by those with their own agendas. Al Jazeera added to the story that a bomb hit the minaret of the mosque, describe such words as ploughing a hole through the building, shattering windows, and leaving the mosque badly damaged. Others still added several more parts to the story, such as removing any mention of the insurgents firing from the mosque, including spinning a narrative into some sort of wanton revenge killing by the Marines during the wider Fallujah campaign, and some even going so far as saying the killing of 60 innocent worshippers at prayer. The point here is that it seems by all parties involved, including those not directly involved in the combat, they adopted a sort of passive thinking. They just received the information and then they passed it on without applying any critical thinking or reasoning before they executed on those decisions. And so what for the Marines? Well, even though the USMC had video evidence and records of what had actually occurred, they couldn't release it due to a security classification limitation. They just followed their information protocol strictly, rather than weighting any other factors to come to a reasoned and evidence-based conclusion. Therefore, the net result was they had ceded the information terrain and irretrievably lost control of the narrative in under 8 hours. The narrative that developed globally was one of heavy-handed coalition tactics, and in the Arab world, the anti-coalition sentiment was inflamed, reasoning that the US were in Iraq for the purposes of conquest and killing Muslims. This narrative spin contributed to a reduced will of Allies' support for the US combat operations in Iraq, eventually leading to the USMC's withdrawal from Fallujah on the 30th of April. The withdrawal was seen as an insurgent victory and coalition defeat. Until this event, many saw resistance against the US as futile. Fallujah and Operation Vigilant Resolve became rallying points and examples of losing the information war, as the loss of narrative placed the US in an untenable strategic position. So what can we learn from that? Well, some reflections are mentioned in Conable's article in the book pictured on your screen. In his article, there's no evidence that any journalist actually witnessed the events and the actions undertaken by the Marines that day. And there was little to no critical analysis in the media reporting. Their pressures to create content, create a subscriber following, and inflame opinion perhaps had more to do with influencing what they did on the day. More than a pursuit of truth verified from multiple perspectives, and moreover the readership whose opinions were inflamed did not deploy their critical thinking skills as insurgent information actions amplified the insurgents' narratives. And arguably the USMC achieved an information own goal through their inaction. Potentially they could have facilitated other options such as media and observer access to the combat site or those combat leaders, or with those that had participated in the battle afterwards to be informed in that information space. And while I'd love to delve into some more examples, I'll just offer a couple for later consideration because we don't have time to do so now. And these are two reference points that anybody who wants to undertake some further research or engage me later, feel free. I'm more than happy to continue the conversation. Clint Watts is quite an entertaining author and he's very engaging, and I recommend his book for those interested in critical thinking as well as operations in the information environment. And Jade Helm, 2015, is a particularly good case study in how passive thinking by several actors allowed for significant manipulation by external actors to the detriment of the US government, its agencies and people. Basically, the vacuum of information created by the US Army for the provided space for the Russian-sponsored mis- and disinformation actors with false identities to propagate false narratives and divide the population. It resulted in a significant nonsensical anxiety amongst Americans that pitted them against their own government, and even for Texas to call out its own state militias in response. I encourage you all to reflect on this well. Okay, so now that I've provided some examples, I'm hearing people saying, yeah, but so what? And hopefully you've got to some context, with a bit of deeper thinking about why critical thinking is important, or at least why it's important to reduce passive thinking and to fill some of that space, particularly as a military professional, and particularly as we're coming to grips with operations in the information environment, where we're reaching out a lot further than we previously used to. So Your decisions are going to occur beyond the isolated context-free zone of Shoalwater Bay training area, and your adversaries will be far more complex than your G2 usually briefs on those operating in 2 to 3 man groups. Future operations are going to occur in a very complex and very dense environment with multiple actors who bring multiple meanings, and not all of those future problems will be solved appropriately through the use of military force alone. Critical thinking provides a guides for navigation in this volatile, uncertain, complex, connected, congested, conflated, and ambiguous environments of the future. So some models for critical thinking, I'll point everybody towards Daniel Kahneman. So noted thinker Daniel Kahneman provides a model for thinking about thinking. He describes System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1, or instinctive thinking, creates some shortcuts and correlations between information to create assumptions based on one piece of information or to generate an imagined correlation. It is important to note that this System 1 is insensitive to the quality and quantity of information input. Therefore, the first impression that lands is generally the one that dominates, even after subsequent information comes to hand, regardless of the quantity or volume. System 2, which is the deeper thinking, tends to accept the conceptualization generated by System 1 as a start point. System 2 thinking begins without acknowledging these assumptions though, but it does allow for deeper thought to arrive at a more considered position. However, this is just a model for thinking about thinking, it's not critical thinking itself. Noted strategic thinker and US Army War College professor, Colonel Garris, he offers us a model for critical thinking that appears to be stepwise or linear, but it offers feedback loops at every stage. It's not a checklist, but it does provide us with a useful handrail about how we can develop our critical thinking skills and how we can communicate as we undertake critical thinking. Now, the majority of decisions we will make every day will make use of a short stimulus response loop. Above the line in Garris's model, as shown on the screen here, could describe Daniel Kahneman's System 1 thinking. So it's an automatic decision-making process. For example, if I hear the horn for the morning coffee van, I'm going to grab my brew mug and head out the door. Importantly, this automatic thinking, it does provide some feedback loops to our assumptions and whether critical thinking was even appropriate for those sorts of decisions. And below the line, that's where critical thinking occurs, and we'll go through that in the next few minutes. So proceeding down the yes arrow, we've made a decision that we need to do some critical thinking. So the first element is to first clarify the concern. So what does that mean? Well, framing it as a concern rather than a problem to be solved is probably the first point, because not everything is a problem to be solved or a problem that requires resolution. Sometimes these things are new pieces of information that could be advantageous to it, or they're things that create connections to other pieces of information and connections that we should inform ourselves about. The concern will need constant revisitation as the consideration progresses and redefine and reconsider as new deductions and connections or new information comes available. Next, we need to consider our point of view. So when we consider our point of view, we need to account for potential barriers to our critical thinking, such as empathy, egocentrism, and ethnocentrism. So empathy here relates to our ability to consider alternative points of views and appreciate the reasoning of others, not just our own, to understand how others came to those decisions or their refusal to act. Egocentrism can be thought of as consideration of one's own opinion as more important than others, and thinking that the way we understand the world to work is the only correct way that the world works. Ethnocentrism is similar, but take that to one's own culture. One is ethnocentric if we consider our own culture is the only one that works, or if it's the only correct one. When we think in those ways of egocentrism and ethnocentrism, we're creating barriers to our own mental models, and we're preventing ourselves from appreciation, and we're preventing ourselves from accessing some of the underlying thinking from other perspectives, and even preventing us from seeing those unknown unknowns. Moving on to inferences. So what I mean by inferences, and Colonel Garris provides some guidance there, is that they're heavily influenced by our own point of view and our own assumptions. They can be described as something that's taken for granted. So it's an internalized process for the individual and how they interpret the world. And usually these inferences are justified because they're developed out of our experiences and what we use to apply our judgment based on our experiences. In that regard, they are somewhat logical. However, there will be gaps, and those gaps are filled by heuristics and assumptions that are not necessarily from complete evidence. Critical thinkers need to understand this and question their assumptions and inferences all the time, because those inferences posited will have impacts on the decisions in the first, second, and third order. And critical thinkers, importantly, are not just working on themselves, they're also going to be receiving a lot of information coming in. And evaluating that information coming in, as any intelligence officer will tell you, it's very important, because military leaders as well will deal with a significant amount of information inputs every day, and even more so when we're involved in combat operations. And our Prussian friend helpfully reminds us that most of the information in warfare is of questionable quality, and much of it is conflicting or doubtful. So critical thinking requires evaluation of the information presented and the source of the presenter. It requires acknowledging our biases of ourselves and others and setting them aside, and it also requires the ability to identify logical fallacies and unconvincing arguments. And I'll go through those in a couple more details on the next two slides. So starting with heuristics, just to define it, they're simplifying strategies or mental models that provide a mechanism to deal with ambiguity or overwhelming information. Cognitive biases are inappropriate application of heuristics. So a couple to be mindful of include, and I'll just list out a few examples, availability bias, which weighs only the information which is to hand without looking any further and without questioning it too much further. Sample size refers to improper generalization, so the old saying of tarring others with the same brush. Regression to the mean describes an expectation to repeat exceedingly low or exceedingly high performance rather than returning to more average trends. Anchoring adjustment, just think of any sort of handover you've ever had where you pick up the last person's tarp or their appreciation without restarting your own from first principles. Overconfidence describes overinflated estimates or optimistic beliefs, and a self-serving bias attributes success to one's own internal factors or externalizes blame to others. Confirmation trap describes cherry-picking of information, finding selective evidence that supports one's own position and discarding anything to the contrary. And fundamental attribution error, put simply, assumes that one's actions describe the type of person that they are rather than the situation or the circumstances that they are in. Moving on to the argument analysis, which is an important skill for critical thinkers. And if you want to test out some of these, I'd recommend listing some of these out and then watching some of the news or watching some politicians or watching cable news programs just to see how good their arguments are. A sound argument requires three elements. It requires an acceptable and consistent premise. It requires evidence that's relevant and supports the conclusion. And it requires that any missing components are considered and judged consistent with the conclusions offered. When arguments deviate from these three principles, that's when you start seeing logical fallacies introduced. Some examples include an ad hominem or an attack on the person, so attacking a person, insulting them, deriding them, rather than making an argument against their position or the evidence that they've provided. A false dichotomy is oversimplifying a complex situation just down to the two alternatives. A great example is when someone's briefing on force protection, when we say, hey, we either need to spend $10 million on force protection or we need to start preparing for consequences. There's plenty of other options in between, like say, for example, what happens if we spend $3 million or what happens if we move to another area. False cause is False cause is misattribution of two closely occurring events to be related or to create a causal link. Just because night follows day doesn't mean that night caused day. Another one is appeal to an unqualified authority, such as those of an irrelevant field rather than an expert from a relevant field. For example, you don't get health advice from your hairdresser, although I will go to my hairdresser when I do need advice on a new haircut, and I will retain seeing my GP when I need health advice. Appeal to fear or implicit threats from harm or possible outcomes. Appeal to masses, put simply, an attempt to convince that everybody else is doing it, therefore it must be good. Or a slippery slope argument which describes an alleged chain reaction resulting from a small initial issue to catastrophic consequences sometime in the future. A weak analogy is presenting an oversimplified or incomplete comparisons and then trying to present them as complete and valid. And lastly is a red herring, so diverting attention onto different topics, which takes us away from the particular issue and concern at hand, also known as shifting the goalposts of an argument. So there's the model, and I'll offer some closing thoughts on Garris's critical thinking model. So I believe that developing critical thinking it is an investment in Army's leadership. We often state that any plan, the enemy will always get a vote. I'd also offer that it's not just the enemy that's going to get a vote in our plans. Each subordinate also comes with their own inputs, as do those in flanking and adjacent formations, our partners and allies, and even those outside of defence, our own population and populations of the global community, not just those in our AO. Helpfully, Bruce Avolio, the noted leadership expert, asserts that leadership development is fundamentally a shift in perspective. The shift occurs when you stop to reflect on an opponent's view to fully understand how he or she can believe the position she has taken and then refuse to move from that position. This is to imply, therefore, that sound leadership requires the empathy to understand the perspective, reasoning and biases of decision-making in others and possess an honest understanding of their own and have the ability to set those biases aside to deliver the most reasoned, logical and evidence-based outcomes for those perspectives. To bring us about to finish where we started, there is neither an app nor is there a template to deliver critical thinking for you. Fortunately, humans are still capable of thinking about thinking and have developed some helpful sources and guides. And the next step will require us to invest in ourselves. We need to read, interact with the knowledge, use it and collaborate to create more as an integrated part of what we do rather than a separate priority that gets pushed to below the line of available effort. For those of you who'd like to review my work, the references are on your screen, and we can also look to further reading if you choose. Hopefully you'll find that these support my arguments as appropriate and relevant. So thank you for your consideration, and of course my thanks to the Cove team for supporting this event, without which many of you certainly would not have been able to participate. And I look forward to more of these events with other thought leaders in this series for 2Div's last Tuesday of the month. PME, facilitated by the Cove, and I encourage anybody who wants to participate, reach out on DPN to me, because nobody has a monopoly on good ideas, and it's certainly not me. Remember, download the Cove app, follow the Cove on Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn, where you can access Cove Plus and on ADEL, and try the new digital badging system. I'll now open the floor to the audience here and online to raise any questions, and I see I'm getting some questions through here. So first question's coming through from Colonel Chris Johnson, Australian Defence College. Thank you for your question, sir. And his question is there such a thing as overcritical thinking? Do we risk slowing down the decision cycle, particularly in large headquarters, by overcomplicating what should be straightforward problems that perhaps could be best solved with intuition? Surely, sometimes the best solution is the simplest one. Great question, sir, and thank you very much for the comment. And I think you pointed to a great point here, is for particularly military professionals, we do need to be multiple things at the same time. And I'd argue that Garris's model actually does support that, because we can't afford, in a contact situation, for example, we can't afford to stop, pull out some books, do a literature review whilst we're under fire. There will always be in defence, and I believe there will always be for armies, the need to do quick off the line of march intuitive decision making to keep a fast decision cycle. However, we cannot rely on those things alone, because they inherently come with a range of assumptions that we have not considered and potentially there's other pieces of information that we've not yet found or even started to connect. So I believe, to answer your question, there will always be that need for intuitive, quick decision making, but it is not the only answer. And whilst it does provide a good template, templates are never good solutions to every single problem. Thank you. Okay, so we have another related question come through from Captain Nathaniel on the line here. He's asked, short question, so what about the JMAP? Well, great question, Nathaniel. And the JMAP, of course, it's always there. And you know, as we know, as military professionals, we do need to follow a process, and the processes are usually put there to provide a sound handrail for us as we step through what we need to do. And it helps provide a guide to our decision-making process to record where we need to be and those things we need to get after. The problem with the JMAP potentially is if we don't engage critical thinking as we use those appreciation tools such as the JMAP or SMAP, we might miss out on some things, and we might take for granted some of our own biases and heuristics from other sorts of appreciations that we've done or our own experiences that may not be relevant to the particular context and the particular problem we're trying to solve. So thank you for your question. I hope that answers it. Another question on the line. Does a hierarchical organisation such as the Australian Army enable or does it deter critical thinking? Great question, and this is one of the things that Colonel Garris was particularly excited about and what provided him a lot of motivation when he provided his lesson packages to the US Army War College on critical thinking. He found often that, particularly in hierarchical organisations such as the Army, and indeed in the US Army, he found that often subordinates or knowledgeable experts outside of their particular lane of comfort, they found they would often defer their good ideas and just defer to the commander or the senior officer in the room rather than feel confident to employ and engage those critical thinking skills. So that is definitely one of the traps we need to avoid in terms of a hierarchical organisation. That's on us as leaders at every rank level. We need to encourage critical thinking. And what I mean by that is it's not just us looking at ourselves and being smart and enabling critical thinking in ourselves. We need to create the space for our peers, for our subordinates to offer that advice and critical thinking. When we go through the JMAP processes and similar military appreciation, or anytime we really need to get to grips with a problem, there's a time for opening the dialogue. Of course, there's a time for decision and execution, but during that period of open dialogue, we need to be comfortable that we can accept criticism and we do not own our ideas. We need to be separate from our ideas so that people can provide better ones, and we should, of course, enable questioning for peers, superiors, subordinates onto those ideas we present, because it's not about us, it's not an attack on us, it's engagement with the idea to debate it, pull it apart, put it back together, and hopefully come up with something better, more considered, and far more reasoned. So thank you for the question. Another question we've got online from Captain Davis at Headquarters Tuative. So thank you for your question. How do you implement critical thinking or prompt yourself to not engage System 1 thinking on a daily or routine basis? For example, what is your threshold to ensure you critically think? Great question, Captain. So me personally, what I do is I've got a few posters up in my office and around my workplace, just as a sort of a reminder about these heuristic traps we can fall into or fallacies. But I think the key thing that I found most useful to me is a piece of advice I got from a senior officer some time ago. Have a fellow traveller. It doesn't have to be someone in your workplace. It doesn't have to be a peer. Just have somebody else to go, this is where I'm thinking, does this sound right? Or, hey, you heard me in that meeting when I offered this idea. Does that sound right? Or am I going off the reservation? Am I off-piste? Sometimes we just need to have those opportunities as a check-in with other people. And if you can't do that, there's other great ways to do it, such as, for example, you might have a diary or a journal, And the Cove offers some great reflective thinking tools to enable that. So they're reflective practices where if you don't have anybody else, have a go writing it out and then come back to it later that day or tomorrow or in a week, and then have a think about your own thinking from a fresh point of view. So that's some great ways to make sure that we're not just going with instinctive, so we're forcing ourselves to review our own decisions as we go. Great question. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think that's enough questions for time for today. We've been going for around about half an hour. So I do appreciate your time and attention today. I know we're all busy, and I look forward to the future sessions with the Cove and future sessions with 2Divs last Tuesday of the month PME. Thank you very much.